Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. That's a lesson that I learned years ago when I was training to be a marriage and family therapist. I trained at a place called the Colorado Institute for Marriage and Family Therapy. And in those days, back in the early 80s, the way we trained was we actually presented cases in front of a one-way mirror. And I was working with a cohort of about 8 therapists and then our 2 trainers. One day, one of the therapists, the case they presented was a 13-year-old who had been a straight A student and had suddenly gone to straight Fs. And as her therapist was presenting the case, he explained in her history that when she was 5, her mother and father had a fight. The father had gotten angry and jumped in his truck, driven off, had a wreck, and was killed. And so it was our hypothesis that the reason this girl might have started flunking out is all of those events from age 5 were starting to manifest themselves and she had begun acting out. And since that particular therapist had been an attorney in previous days, we decided we would hold a trial. So we put the mother and the daughter in there with the therapist. And so he turned to them, to the little girl actually, and said, behind these one-way mirrors sit a judge and a jury. And they'd like to know whether or not you have any charges to bring up against your mom. And that little girl stood up and said, murder in the first degree. And we all went, bingo, we guessed it. I mean, that's kind of what's going on with her. So the therapist said, would you please present your case? And so this 13-year-old must have been watching too much Perry Mason or some sort of drama on television, because she began to march back and forth in front of the mirror telling us what happened on the day of her father's death and about the fight and everything she remembered as a 5-year-old. And then she began talking about the police coming and just the tragedy of learning her dad was gone and her confusion. And she finally finished the story and she just said, I rest my case. And so we sent a note in via another therapist that read as follows. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged. What verdict would you like? And that little girl stood up and she said, life in prison. So that therapist left. And we went and we got a long piece of rope and we took 2 chairs and we tied them together back to back and we wrapped the mother and the daughter up and tied them. And the knots were in front of the little girl, so the only way they could get loose would be she would have to untie the knots. And then we read another prepared statement to her from the group behind the mirror, and it read something like this. We want you to know how much we admire your willingness to make sure that justice is done in this case. Rarely have we come across someone at your age who's willing to sacrifice their life to make sure that this punishment is carried out. Because where someone has a life in prison sentence, there also has to be a jailer. And the fact that you're willing to serve in that role and sacrifice your life to see this done, to us is admirable. At the same time, we would certainly understand if you were to choose to set yourself free and release your mother so you could have your own life. We wouldn't judge you for that. And then they just walked out. And so we think we're being very clever. Until 5 hours later, we're still sitting there and this mother and this daughter are still tied together and we're going, oh my gosh, somebody's got to go to the bathroom at some point. And in the long run, the little girl, she untied herself and runs out of the room and we all go chasing her and it was all dramatic. But it was such a great visual for me to understand what retaliation or retribution or feeling like a need to carry out justice, what it literally cost the person who's trying to do that, that it keeps you tied to the other person, perhaps for life. So to me, forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. It's the thing you do so that you can be free and you no longer have to be tied to that other person. And when it comes to infidelity, I certainly understand the need for retribution or retaliation or vengeance or whatever. That makes sense. But you're not a fool to untie yourself from that and to choose to forgive so that you can have a life. And so consider that. Give yourself a gift. Choose to forgive so that you can move on to healing.